In the shadow of Colorado's Rocky Mountains, nestled in a narrow canyon where perpetual darkness descends for weeks each winter, sits Silver Plume, a place locals call the living ghost town. With a population hovering around 130 residents in the late 1980s, this isolated mining town became the epicenter of one of Colorado's most perplexing mysteries. Within the span of just 1 year, two men vanished from the same building under eerily similar circumstances, leaving behind questions that continue to haunt investigators and family members more than 3 decades later. On September 7, 1987, Tom Young, a 49-year-old Army Special Forces veteran and bookstore owner, closed up his shop and disappeared with his dog into the mountains. Nearly 1 year later, on August 7, 1988, Keith Reinhard, a 49-year-old Chicago sports writer who had moved into Young's former shop space and become obsessed with writing a novel about his predecessor's disappearance, also vanished without a trace. While Young's remains were eventually found, ruled a suicide by authorities despite lingering doubts, Keith Reinhard was never seen again. The chilling parallels between these two cases, the same building, the same age, disappearances almost exactly 1 year apart, Reinhard's obsessive interest in Young's fate, and the final paragraphs of Reinhard's unfinished novel that seemed to eerily predict his own disappearance, have fueled decades of speculation, conspiracy theories, and unanswered questions. This is their story. Silver Plume, the living ghost town. To understand these disappearances, one must first understand Silver Plume itself, a town seemingly frozen in time, where tragedy and mystery have been woven into the very fabric of its existence since its founding in the 1860s. Silver Plume sits in Clear Creek County, approximately 50 miles west of Denver along Interstate 70, nestled in the Front Range of the Rocky Mountains at an elevation of over 9,000 feet. Founded in 1864 as a gold camp, the town's fortune changed when prospectors discovered rich veins of silver, or instead, what early miners had dismissed as worthless grayish or turned out to be silver, and thus the town earned its name. At its peak during the silver boom of the 1870s and 1880s, the town thrived with miners, merchants, and dreamers seeking their fortune in the earth. However, the Panic of 1893 devastated Silver Plume when the U.S. government abandoned the silver standard in favor of an all-gold monetary system. Silver prices plummeted, mines closed, and Silver Plume's population collapsed virtually overnight. What remained was a haunting shell of its former self. By the 1980s, only around 200 people called Silver Plume home, a curious mix of artists, teachers, builders, and those seeking refuge from city life. The town's geography contributes to its unsettling atmosphere. Steep canyon walls sandwich the narrow valley, creating a place of deep shadows and perpetual gloom. The north side of town, where most residents live, receives as little as 2 hours of direct sunlight per day during winter months. The south side of town sees virtually no direct sunlight at all for approximately 6 weeks each year, from late November through early January. This perpetual darkness, combined with howling mountain winds that can exceed 100 miles per hour and temperatures that plunge well below zero, creates an environment that feels simultaneously beautiful and foreboding. Adding to the town's dark mystique is its history of mysterious and violent deaths. On a cliff face above the town stands a 10-foot granite monument to Clifford Griffin, superintendent of the 730 mine, who died by a gunshot to the head in 1887. Griffin had come to Silver Plume consumed by grief after his fiancée's death in New York. In his suicide note, he requested that the mountainside be his eternal resting place, because that was where he felt the most tranquility. The town honored his wish, erecting the monument that still looms over Silver Plume today, a constant reminder of tragedy. Local legends claim Griffin's spirit still roams through the mine tunnels, adding to Silver Plume's reputation as a genuinely haunted place. Into this dark, isolated, and history-laden setting came Tom Young and, later, Keith Reinhard. Tom Young, the bookshop owner who walked into the mountains, the man and his life. Tom Young was 49 years old in 1987, though some sources report him as 47. He was a former high school art teacher and retired U.S. Army Special Forces veteran who had found his way to Silver Plume seeking solitude and a simpler life. After leaving the military, Young had taught art in Arvada, Colorado, embodying an almost Bob Ross-esque transformation from soldier to gentle artist. He had moved to Silver Plume in 1969, drawn by the town's isolation and beauty. Young ran a small bookshop called Charing Cross Station on the town's main street, operating out of a retail space in the Old Knights of Pythias building, a structure with its own history as a meeting place for the fraternal organization, somewhat akin to Freemasons. The name of his shop was a literary reference to the famous Charing Cross Station in London and the beloved book, 84, Charing Cross Road by Helene Have. By all accounts, Young was an eccentric but well-liked member of the small community. He was a quiet man who valued his privacy, content with the company of his loyal black Labrador retriever named Gus, his books, and his solitary walks in the surrounding Rocky Mountains. Residents recalled his quirky behavior with fondness, particularly his habit of playing catch with Gus using a baby doll's head, an odd but harmless eccentricity that characterized his gentle, if unconventional, nature. Young and Gus were inseparable companions, a familiar sight walking the streets of Silver Plume or hiking into the mountains. Young lived in an A-frame house on the south side of town, across the valley divide from where most residents lived. This placed him in the darkest part of Silver Plume, on the north-facing slope where sunlight was most scarce during the long winter months. It was a fitting home for a man who seemed to embrace solitude and shadow. The Disappearance. On September 7th, 1987, Tom Young closed his bookshop and disappeared. He and Gus were last seen walking into the Rocky Mountains, something that wasn't particularly unusual given Young's love of hiking. However, what made this departure different was what Young had told some friends and acquaintances. He was planning a vacation to Europe, an extended trip that would keep him away for some time. For weeks, no one in Silver Plume suspected anything was wrong. They assumed Tom had simply departed on his European adventure as planned. His shop remained closed, its windows dark, books gathering dust on the shelves. However, as time passed, inconsistencies began to emerge that troubled those who knew him. Young's family knew nothing about any planned European vacation. He had never mentioned it to them. When authorities eventually checked the boarding kennels where Gus was typically kept during Young's travels, the dog wasn't there. This was deeply troubling. Tom and Gus had always been together. It was unthinkable that Young would leave Gus behind for such a long trip, let alone fail to make arrangements for his beloved companion's care. Furthermore, investigators could find no record of a plane ticket, no passport activity, no credit card purchases, no evidence whatsoever that Young had actually planned or taken a European vacation. The Europe trip story, it seemed, had been a deliberate fabrication, meant to delay suspicion and buy time. But time for what? After several weeks of unexplained absence, concerned residents reported Tom Young as a missing person. The Clear Creek County Sheriff's Office began an investigation, but in the vast and treacherous terrain of the Rocky Mountains, finding traces of a missing person is notoriously difficult. The mountains around Silver Plume are a maze of steep cliffs, dense forests, abandoned mine shafts, and countless places where a person, or a body, could remain hidden for years, decades, or forever. Months passed with no leads, no sightings, no clues. The bookshop remained closed. Silver Plume's small population whispered theories and worries, but Tom Young and Gus had seemingly vanished into thin air. The discovery, on July 31st, 1988, almost 11 months after Young's disappearance. Two local hunters exploring Republican Mountain, also referred to as Sherman Mountain in some accounts, approximately 1.5 miles outside Silver Plume, made a grim discovery. About an hour's walk into the wilderness, they found skeletal remains propped against a tree. Nearby lay a backpack, a Smith & Wesson Model 36 revolver, and the skeletal remains of a dog. The remains were identified as Tom Young and Gus. Both had died from gunshot wounds to the head. The investigation revealed several key facts that would prove crucial and controversial. Young had purchased the revolver found at the scene just 4 days before his disappearance on September 7, 1987. Some reports mentioned that shreds of a green tarp were found with the bodies, suggesting that the remains had been purposely concealed at some point, though weather and time had torn the tarp apart. Based on the evidence, the Clear Creek County Sheriff's Department and the coroner's office officially ruled Tom Young's death a suicide. The case was closed. Tom Young, the Army veteran turned art teacher turned bookstore owner, had apparently walked into the mountains with his dog, shot Gus, and then turned the gun on himself. At least, that was the official conclusion. Lingering doubts and unanswered questions. However, not everyone accepted the suicide ruling. Several disturbing questions remained unanswered, causing many who knew Tom Young to question the official conclusion. Questions that would take on even greater significance after Keith Reinhard's disappearance. First, there was the matter of Gus. Tom Young was known to be extraordinarily fond of his dog. The two were constant companions, and those who knew Young well found it impossible to believe he would shoot Gus before taking his own life. While it's not unheard of for people contemplating suicide to kill their pets, often driven by the belief that no one else could care for them properly or wanting to spare them the imagined suffering of abandonment, this seemed completely out of character for Young. Why would a man who loved his dog so deeply subject Gus to such a violent end? Young was a Special Forces veteran who had seen combat. He understood weapons and death. If he truly intended to end his own life, why wouldn't he have humanely arranged for Gus to be cared for? Or at minimum left the dog in town, where someone would find and care for him? Second, according to the television show Unsolved Mysteries, which featured this case in 2 different episodes, ballistics testing was unable to match the bullets recovered from the bodies to the gun found at the scene. While some reports suggest this testing was never conducted at all due to the decomposed state of the remains, others indicate the results were inconclusive. Either way, the lack of definitive ballistic evidence linking the weapon to the deaths raised serious questions about whether this was truly a suicide or potentially something more sinister. If the gun found at the scene wasn't the murder weapon, where was it? And who had pulled the trigger? Third, there was the suspicious timing and nature of the gun purchase. Young bought the weapon just days before his disappearance, which seemed to suggest premeditation. But premeditation of what? Did he buy it for protection because he felt threatened? Had someone been harassing him or making him feel unsafe? Or was it, as the suicide theory suggests, purchased with the sole intention of ending his life? The timing adds an element of planning that troubles those seeking answers. Fourth, there was the tarp. If Tom Young had died by suicide, why would his body have been covered with a green tarp? Dead men don't cover themselves. This detail suggested that someone else had been present, someone who had attempted to conceal the bodies. Was this evidence of foul play? Or had a hiker stumbled upon the scene and, in panic or for unknown reasons, attempted to cover the remains before fleeing? Fifth, there was Young's behavior before his disappearance. He had spoken to friends about his European vacation, suggesting plans for the future. He hadn't exhibited obvious signs of depression or distress to most who knew him, though it's important to note that many people who die by suicide don't display outward warning signs, especially men of Young's generation who were taught to suppress emotional vulnerability. Despite these questions, authorities maintained their suicide conclusion. The case was officially closed. Tom Young was laid to rest, his death adding one more tragic chapter to Silver Plume's dark history. The old Knights of Pythias building stood empty, Young's bookshop closed and abandoned. But the story was far from over. Just 1 week after Tom Young's remains were discovered, the mystery would deepen in ways no one could have anticipated. Keith Reinhard, the journalist who followed a midlife crisis and dreams deferred. Keith Raymond Reinhard was born on September 10, 1938, and was approaching his 50th birthday in 1988, a milestone that weighed heavily on his mind. For 22 years, he had worked as a sports writer for the Chicago Daily Herald, primarily covering high school sports in the Chicago suburbs. It was honest work, and he was good at it, but Keith had always dreamed of something more. He had grown up in Algonquin, Illinois, with his childhood friend Ted Parker, whom he had known for approximately 40 years. The two boys had lived across the street from each other and shared countless adventures. While Keith had pursued journalism, Ted had eventually made his way west to Colorado, where he ran a cafe in the small mountain town of Silver Plume. By 1988, Keith Reinhard felt trapped. He lived in Algonquin with his wife Carolyn and their children, including his daughter Tiffany and son Sven. Keith also had another son, Kai, from a previous relationship. He had built a respectable career, but he increasingly felt the weight of unfulfilled dreams. The monotony of covering the same high school basketball and football games year after year was wearing on him. Big city life in the Chicago suburbs felt suffocating. He wanted to write a novel, not just any novel, but the great American novel that would establish him as a serious writer, not just a sports reporter. As his 50th birthday approached, Keith experienced what his son Sven later described as a sense of urgency, the feeling that time was running out to do the things he had always dreamed of doing. He feared that if he didn't act soon, he would wake up at 60 or 70 having lived a life of quiet desperation, never having taken risks or pursued his passions. Keith had other dreams, too. He wanted to escape the city and live in nature, to test himself physically by overcoming his fear of heights through mountain climbing, to get in better physical shape, and to rediscover who he really was beneath the layers of routine and responsibility that had accumulated over decades of adulthood. In early 1988, Keith began formulating a plan. His old friend Ted Parker had been telling him about Silver Plume for years, the isolated mountain town where life moved at a different pace, where the air was thin and clean, where a man could think and create without the constant noise and distraction of modern life. Ted even had a vacant shop space available, retail space in the old Knights of Pythias building on Main Street, the same building where Tom Young had operated his bookshop. In June 1988, Keith negotiated a 3-month sabbatical from the Daily Herald. Though his wife Carolyn was initially wary of the idea, she worried about their family, their finances, and the wisdom of Keith's midlife adventure. She eventually agreed to support his dream. There were tentative plans for her to visit him in Silver Plume, though these visits would never materialize. Keith prepared for his transformation. He grew his hair long and grew a full beard, marking a visible break from his clean-cut newspaper reporter persona. He looked more like a mountain man or a 1960s poet than a suburban sports writer. In June 1988, he packed his things and headed west to Colorado, leaving behind his family and career to pursue a new chapter in his life. At the time Keith left for Colorado, Tom Young had been missing for 9 months. His remains had not yet been discovered. The mystery of the bookstore owner's disappearance hung over Silver Plume like a shadow. Arrival in Silver Plume and the discovery of Tom Young's story. Keith Reinhard arrived in Silver Plume in June 1988 and immediately set about establishing his new life. He rented the shop space from Ted Parker, the same building where Tom Young had operated his bookstore. Keith opened an antique shop and began selling matted photographs, hoping to generate some income from summer tourists while working on his novel. He also rented a small apartment in the back of an abandoned Catholic church, creating a living situation as isolated and atmospheric as one could imagine, sleeping in a former house of worship, surrounded by mountains and history. Initially, Keith struggled with severe writer's block. The inspiration he had hoped to find in Silver Plume's mountains and solitude eluded him. The blank page remained blank. He took regular hikes into the rugged Rocky Mountains, hoping the serene yet treacherous landscape would spark his creativity. He worked on overcoming his fear of heights, pushing himself to climb higher into the mountains despite his discomfort and occasional bouts of vertigo that would force him to retreat. Then, shortly after his arrival, Keith learned something that would change everything. The shop space he had rented had a history, a dark and mysterious history. The previous tenant of the building, a man named Tom Young, who had run a bookshop, had disappeared the previous September. Tom and his dog Gus had vanished, and at the time Keith moved in, their fate was still unknown. For a journalist and aspiring novelist starved for inspiration, Tom Young's mysterious disappearance was irresistible. Here was a real-life mystery, a compelling story unfolding in the very walls where Keith now worked. He began asking questions, interviewing locals who had known Tom Young, gathering every detail he could about the missing bookstore owner. What had started as casual curiosity quickly evolved into something more intense. What many who knew Keith would later describe as an obsession. The novel and the blurring of reality. Keith abandoned his original novel idea completely and threw himself entirely into writing about Tom Young's disappearance. The novel would be a fictionalized account, but one that drew heavily on both Tom Young's life and Keith's own experiences in Silver Plume. His daughter Tiffany would later recall that her father talked about Tom Young's disappearance constantly, consumed by the mystery. Every conversation seemed to circle back to Tom Young. Who was he? Why did he disappear? What had happened to him? Keith interviewed Ted Parker and other Silver Plume residents, taking detailed notes on his computer, building a comprehensive picture of Young's life and character. The protagonist of Keith's novel was named Guy Gypsum, and he lived in a town called White Flume, an obvious fictional stand-in for Silver Plume. But Guy Gypsum was neither purely Tom Young nor purely Keith Reinhard. Instead, the character became a composite of both men, blending Young's history with Keith's present, creating someone who existed in the liminal space between fact and fiction, between two lives that were beginning to eerily mirror each other. As Keith wrote, Guy Gypsum seemed to become an idealized version of who Keith wanted to be past the age of 50, a man who had escaped the constraints of conventional life, found peace in the mountains, overcome his fears, and lived authentically according to his own values. The boundaries between Keith the author, Keith the character, Tom Young the subject, and Guy Gypsum the creation began to blur. Tiffany later noted that writers often like to live the story they're writing about, to get a feel for the experiences they're describing, so they can write about them more authentically. Keith's immersion in Tom Young's story and his own similar circumstances in Silver Plume. Both men around the same age, both seeking escape from previous lives, both renting the same building, both walking the same mountains, created a strange dissolution of the membrane between observer and subject, between writer and story. Then, on July 31st, 1988, everything changed. Hunters discovered Tom Young's remains on Republican Mountain. The mystery Keith had been investigating and writing about was suddenly solved. Tom Young's death was ruled a suicide. 1 week later, Keith Reinhard would vanish, creating a mystery even more perplexing and enduring than the one he had been investigating. August 7th, 1988, the day Keith Reinhard disappeared. The week following the discovery of Tom Young's body was tumultuous in Silver Plume. The small town was processing the news that Young's disappearance had ended in apparent suicide. Keith Reinhard was among those most affected by the discovery. He had spent weeks or months building a narrative about Tom Young, investigating his life, trying to understand his disappearance. Now that mystery had been solved, at least officially. On August 3rd, just 4 days before his own disappearance, Keith attended a memorial service for Tom Young. Just before the service, he spoke to an old colleague back at the Chicago Daily Herald. They discussed the possibility of Keith becoming the new basketball writer for the paper, which would mean covering the Chicago Bulls, a prestigious assignment. However, The promotion had gone to a work rival whom Keith intensely disliked. This phone call suggested that despite his adventure in Silver Plume, Keith was still considering his future in journalism, still connected to his old life, still contemplating a return. On August 7th, 1988, exactly 1 week after Tom Young's remains were discovered, and almost exactly 1 year after Tom Young had disappeared, Young vanished on September 7th, 1987. Keith disappeared on August 7th, 1988. Keith Reinhard made a series of strange decisions. Around 2:30 p.m., he closed his antique shop earlier than usual. Then, in what witnesses would later describe as bizarrely deliberate behavior, Keith walked through the streets of Silver Plume, making a point of telling everyone he encountered that he was going to hike to the summit of Pendleton Mountain. He told Ted Parker at the cafe. He told other shopkeepers. He told friends and acquaintances. It was as if he wanted to ensure that everyone in town knew exactly what he was planning to do. Pendleton Mountain is a formidable 12,275-foot peak just south of Interstate 70. It's a difficult climb even for experienced mountaineers, requiring approximately 6 hours round trip under ideal conditions for someone in excellent physical condition. The mountain is covered with boulders, rocks, and steep drops hidden by thick forests. There are no maintained trails. The terrain is treacherous, with numerous ways to become injured or lost. Keith's announcement was strange for several reasons. First, he had a known fear of heights and had experienced vertigo on previous climbing attempts, always retreating before reaching significant elevation. Second, it was 5 p.m., some sources say 4:30 p.m. or 2:30 p.m., but most agree it was late afternoon. Far too late in the day to begin a difficult 6-hour hike. Sunset in Silver Plume in early August occurs around 8 p.m., which meant Keith would be attempting to descend a dangerous, trailless mountain in complete darkness. Third, he was completely unprepared. He was wearing casual clothing, blue jeans and a flannel shirt, and gym shoes, not hiking boots. He carried no backpack, no climbing gear, no flashlight, no emergency supplies, no map, no compass. Some accounts mention he may have carried a single can of soda. That was it. Fourth, and perhaps most significantly, Keith told people that if he didn't return by 10 p.m., they should call the authorities because something would have gone wrong. This statement struck many as eerily specific, almost as if Keith was setting up a timeline for his own disappearance. Most residents of Silver Plume didn't take Keith seriously. They assumed he was just talking, that he wouldn't actually attempt such a foolhardy hike. "You're right, dude," seemed to be the general response. But Keith Reinhard was seen leaving Silver Plume, heading south toward the base of Pendleton Mountain. That was the last time anyone saw Keith Reinhard alive. The search, one of Colorado's largest manhunts. When Keith Reinhard failed to return by 10 p.m. on August 7th, his friend Ted Parker became concerned. By morning, when there was still no sign of Keith, Parker contacted the Clear Creek County Sheriff's Office. What followed was one of the largest search and rescue operations in Colorado history. On August 8th, 1988, Colorado's Alpine Rescue Team launched a massive search effort. Over the next 7 days, more than 200 volunteers combed Pendleton Mountain's treacherous terrain. The operation included ground search teams of experienced Mountaineers 12 trained search dogs from the Colorado Alpine Rescue Team Army, Chinook helicopters providing aerial reconnaissance, civil air patrol planes conducting systematic searches, specialized technical rescue teams for navigating the mountain's vertical faces and abandoned mine shafts. The search dogs produced intriguing but ultimately inconclusive results. One bloodhound seemed to pick up Keith's scent along the old railroad grade trail south of the Silver Plume I-70 exit, the expected starting point for a hike up Pendleton Mountain. This suggested that Keith had indeed begun his climb, as he had told people he would. However, 2 other search dogs did not respond to the same area, creating uncertainty about the reliability of the single positive alert. Searchers covered the 3,000 vertical feet of Pendleton Mountain systematically, but the terrain presented extraordinary challenges. The mountain is a chaos of boulders and rock fields, thick forests that hide sudden drops, snow-covered areas even in August, and countless abandoned mine shafts from Silver Plume's mining era, any of which could have concealed a body. After 6 days of intensive searching, tragedy struck the search operation itself. On August 13th, a Civil Air Patrol plane piloted by Terry Ledence crashed into Pendleton Mountain while conducting an aerial search. Ledence was killed instantly, and his spotter, Don Drobny, was badly injured. The crash site became a secondary emergency, requiring rescue efforts for the downed aircraft even as the search for Keith Reinhard continued. On August 14th, 1988, after 7 days and more than 10,000 man-hours logged by hundreds of searchers, the official search for Keith Reinhard was called off. The decision was made partly due to the plane crash, partly due to deteriorating weather with heavy rainstorms, and partly because the search had yielded absolutely nothing. No trace of Keith, no clothing, no supplies, no body, no clues whatsoever. For the Colorado Alpine Rescue Team, this represented their first failure in 30 years of operation. They had found every person they had searched for prior to Keith Reinhard. Their perfect record was broken. Keith Reinhard had seemingly vanished into thin air. The unfinished novel, eerie foreshadowing. During the search, investigators examined Keith Reinhard's apartment in the back of the abandoned church. On his personal computer, they found his unfinished novel about Tom Young. The manuscript provided crucial insights into Keith's state of mind and raised deeply disturbing questions. The final paragraphs of the novel described Guy Gypsum disappearing into the mountains. The passages read almost like a description of Keith's own disappearance, written before it happened. This discovery fueled immediate speculation that Keith had staged his own disappearance, using his novel as a blueprint for vanishing. The theory gained traction for several reasons. Keith had a history of running away. He had run away from home at age 16 and traveled the western United States for several weeks without contacting anyone before returning. He had expressed interest in visiting West Virginia and the eastern United States shortly before his disappearance. His very public announcements about climbing Pendleton Mountain seemed designed to create a false trail, to ensure everyone believed he had gone up the mountain when perhaps he had gone elsewhere entirely. However, several facts argue against the staged disappearance theory. Most significantly, there has been no activity on Keith Reinhard's bank accounts or credit cards since August 7, 1988. In an era before it was possible to live completely off the grid, the total absence of any financial footprint for over 3 decades is virtually impossible unless Keith truly is dead. Additionally, Keith was close to his children, particularly his sons Sven and Kai. It seems unlikely that he would abandon them completely, especially as they grew older and he missed significant life milestones, graduations, marriages, grandchildren. Theories and speculation. What really happened? In the decades since Keith Reinhard's disappearance, numerous theories have emerged attempting to explain what happened to him and whether his disappearance is connected to Tom Young's death. Theory 1. Accidental death on Pendleton Mountain. The most straightforward explanation is that Keith did exactly what he said he was going to do. He attempted to climb Pendleton Mountain despite his inadequate preparation and died trying. This is the theory that Keith's friend Ted Parker has maintained for over 30 years. In this scenario, Keith may have successfully reached higher elevations, but then became disoriented in the darkness on his descent. He could have slipped and fallen down a cliff, face-tumbled into an abandoned mine shaft. There are numerous undocumented shafts throughout the area. Become injured and succumbed to exposure, been attacked by a mountain lion or other wildlife, become lost and died of hypothermia. Even in August, nighttime temperatures at high elevations can drop below freezing. The rugged terrain of Pendleton Mountain would make it entirely possible for a body to remain undiscovered for decades. The thick forest canopy, deep crevasses, unstable rock fields subject to slides that could bury remains, and the sheer vastness of the search area mean that Keith's body could still be out there, waiting to be found. This theory is supported by the 2021 discovery of Keith's wallet on Pendleton Mountain. More on this below, suggesting he did indeed begin the climb as planned. Theory 2. Suicide. Some investigators and observers believe Keith Reinhard died by suicide, mirroring Tom Young's fate. This theory suggests that Keith became so immersed in Tom Young's story that he essentially recreated Young's final act, either consciously or unconsciously. Evidence supporting this theory includes Keith's midlife crisis and expressions of feeling trapped, his obsessive focus on Tom Young's death, the final paragraphs of his novel, which could be interpreted as a suicide note disguised as fiction, his deliberate creation of a public record of his intentions, telling everyone about the hike, the symbolic nature of disappearing exactly 1 week after Tom's body was found. However, this theory has significant weaknesses. Keith showed no obvious signs of suicidal ideation to his family or friends. There is no evidence he owned or purchased a firearm. His phone call about the bull's riding position suggests he was still making plans for the future. And unlike Tom Young, no body has ever been found. Theory 3. Staged disappearance. This theory holds that Keith deliberately vanished to start a new life elsewhere. Proponents point to his history of running away as a teenager, the eerie similarity between his disappearance and his novel's plot, his very public pronouncements about climbing Pendleton, creating a false trail, his midlife crisis and dissatisfaction with his previous life, the possibility that Tom Young's death gave him the idea. However, this theory struggles to explain the complete absence of any financial activity, sightings, or contact with family for over 35 years. It also requires believing that Keith would abandon his children and never reach out, even decades later when they were adults. Theory 4. Foul play. Keith's son Kai has long believed that both his father and Tom Young were victims of foul play. This theory suggests several possible scenarios. Scenario A. Serial killer. Some have speculated that a serial killer was operating in the area. Multiple bodies have been discovered in the mountains around Silver Plume over the years. However, law enforcement has found no evidence of a serial killer, and the circumstances of the 2 disappearances don't match typical serial killer patterns. Scenario B. Tom Young's killer returns. If Tom Young was murdered rather than suicide, it's possible that Keith's investigation into Young's disappearance made the killer nervous. Keith was asking questions, interviewing people, digging into Young's life. Perhaps he discovered something or talked to someone that made the killer feel threatened, leading to Keith's murder. This theory would explain the timing. Keith disappeared just 1 week after Tom's body was found, exactly when attention was being drawn back to the case. It would explain why Keith has never been found. The killer successfully concealed the body, having learned from Tom Young's discovery. It would explain the strange ballistics issues with Tom Young's gun. Scenario C. Someone else entirely. There are vague suggestions in some accounts that Keith was seen talking to an unidentified female at a party at the KP building in Silver Plume shortly before his disappearance. Could he have been involved with someone who posed a threat? Was there a romantic entanglement that ended badly? However, no solid evidence supports any foul play theory. No suspects have ever been identified. No witnesses have come forward. No forensic evidence has been found. Theory 5. Carbon monoxide poisoning. One of the more recent and scientifically interesting theories suggests that both Tom Young and Keith Reinhard may have been suffering from chronic carbon monoxide poisoning from a leak in the Old Knights of Pythias building. This theory emerged from research showing that carbon monoxide exposure can cause depression and suicidal ideation, confusion, and poor decision-making personality, changes impulsive behavior. A 2021 study found that police officers who drove Ford Expeditions and Explorers with carbon monoxide leaking into the cabin from the engine had shockingly high rates of suicide. The theory suggests that both Young and Reinhard, spending significant time in the same building, were unknowingly being poisoned, leading to their self-destructive decisions. This would explain why both men rented the same space and both disappeared, why Young might have shot his beloved dog, impaired judgment, why Keith made the bizarre decision to attempt a dangerous hike with no preparation. The timing. Both disappeared during late summer when building ventilation might have been poorer. However, this theory has significant problems. The disappearances occurred in late summer/early fall when heating, and thus carbon monoxide production, would have been minimal. There's no evidence the building had any carbon monoxide issues. And this theory still requires Keith to have accidentally died on the mountain or deliberately walked into it despite CO poisoning, leaving his body unfound for 35-plus years. New evidence. The 2021 wallet discovery. In September 2021, over 33 years after Keith Reinhard's disappearance, two hikers made a potentially significant discovery on Pendleton Mountain. While hiking and filming footage for what would become a documentary about the Reinhard case, they found Keith's wallet. The wallet was reportedly intact, with its contents still present. The location of the discovery was on Pendleton Mountain, in the general area where Keith would have been hiking if he had indeed attempted to summit the peak, as he told people he would. This discovery provides the strongest physical evidence to date that Keith Reinhard did in fact begin his climb up Pendleton Mountain on August 7, 1988. It supports the testimony of the bloodhound that picked up his scent at the base of the mountain. It suggests that Keith's public pronouncements about his intentions were truthful rather than misdirection. The wallet discovery lends significant credence to the accidental death theory. If Keith was on Pendleton Mountain with his wallet, and that wallet remained there for over 3 decades, it strongly suggests Keith is somewhere on that mountain as well. However, the discovery also raises new questions. Why wasn't the wallet found during the massive 1988 search? How did 2 hikers happen upon it decades later when hundreds of trained searchers missed it? And if the wallet is there, where is Keith's body? The wallet has been turned over to authorities and Keith's family, but as of 2025, it has not led to the discovery of Keith Reinhard's remains. The dark side of the mountain, an ongoing investigation. The case of Keith Reinhard and Tom Young has fascinated investigators, journalists, and documentary filmmakers for decades. A documentary titled Dark Side of the Mountain, directed by Eric Walter, has been in production since 2014, working closely with Keith's family to investigate the disappearance and explore the various theories. The documentary team has conducted their own searches of Pendleton Mountain, working with Dr. William C. Butler, a forensic scientist and former member of the Alpine Rescue Team who participated in the original 1988 search. These renewed search efforts have brought together volunteers, Keith's children Kai and Michaela, and retired law enforcement officials. The case has also been featured on multiple television programs. Unsolved Mysteries aired segments in 2 different incarnations, with Robert Stack and later with Dennis Farina. Travel Channel's Lost in the Wild dedicated an episode to the case. Various true crime podcasts and YouTube channels have covered the story. The Clear Creek County Sheriff's Office maintains an open case file on Keith Reinhard's disappearance. Lieutenant Steve Gramillion of the Clear Creek Sheriff's Office has stated, "There's too many possibilities and not enough evidence to determine what happened. The family's left behind." Perhaps the most tragic aspect of this case is the toll it has taken on those left behind. Keith's son Kai Reinhard has dedicated significant time and resources to searching for his father. He has conducted his own searches of Pendleton Mountain, participated in documentary projects, and given numerous interviews, keeping his father's case in the public eye. Kai has placed a memorial plaque on a mountain near Silver Plume, inscribed with his father's own word from when Keith was a boy. "Oh God, I want to wander." Kai believes his father was the victim of foul play and continues to hope the mystery can be solved. Keith's son Sven Reinhard tragically died of carbon monoxide poisoning in November 2001, adding another layer of tragedy to the family story. Some have noted the bitter irony if carbon monoxide poisoning played a role in Keith's disappearance as well. For Carolyn Reinhard, Keith's wife, the lack of closure has been particularly difficult. She never got to say goodbye, never received confirmation of what happened, never got to bury her husband. The ambiguity of a missing person case, the inability to fully grieve or move forward, is a unique and painful form of suffering. Tom Young's family faces similar questions, though at least they have remains to bury. The lingering doubt about whether Tom's death was truly suicide or something more sinister prevents complete closure. Silver Plume today, a town still haunted. Silver Plume remains a small, isolated mountain town with a population that has actually decreased to around 130 residents, even fewer than in the 1980s. The old Knights of Pythias building still stands on Main Street, though it no longer houses a bookshop or antique store. The town's dark reputation has only grown with the passage of time. Locals still talk about the twin disappearances. Some residents who were there in 1988 remain, carrying their memories and theories. The town has embraced its haunted history to some degree, with the Georgetown Loop Railroad bringing tourists through the area who sometimes ask about the mysterious cases. But Silver Plume remains what it has always been, a living ghost town, a place where the past seems to linger in the perpetual shadows cast by the mountains, where tragedy has woven itself into the very landscape. Conclusion: an enduring mystery. More than 35 years after Keith Reinhard walked into those mountains, we are no closer to definitively answering what happened to him. More than 37 years after Tom Young disappeared, questions remain about whether his death was truly suicide. The parallels between the two cases remain striking and unsettling. Both men were 49 years old, both operated businesses from the same building, both disappeared into the mountains around Silver Plume. The disappearances occurred almost exactly 1 year apart, September 7th, 1987, and August 7th, 1988. Keith had become obsessed with Tom's story. Both were experiencing midlife crises of sorts. Both made unusual statements before disappearing. Tom about Europe, Keith about Pendleton. Are these parallels mere coincidence? The result of Keith unconsciously or consciously replicating Tom's fate? Evidence of a connection that suggests foul play? Or something else entirely? The discovery of Keith's wallet in 2021 provides the strongest evidence to date that his body likely remains on Pendleton Mountain, waiting to be found. But until that discovery is made, the case remains open, the theories remain unproven, and Keith Reinhard remains missing. Detective Dave Dowenhauer of the Clear Creek County Sheriff's Department perhaps put it best. What happened to Keith Reinhard and Tom Young has been knocked around and embellished so much, it's hard to know where the truth ends and glamorization begins. In Silver Plume, where shadows fall deep and winter darkness lingers for weeks, where abandoned mine shafts and mountain peaks guard their secrets jealously, two men vanished into legend. Tom Young's remains were found, but questions persist. Keith Reinhard remains lost, somewhere in those mountains or somewhere else entirely. The mystery endures, haunting Silver Plume's narrow valley, a reminder that sometimes the mountains keep their secrets forever, and sometimes truth is stranger and more elusive than any fiction a novelist could create. Perhaps Keith Reinhard's own words, inscribed on the memorial plaque his son placed in the mountains, provide the most fitting epitaph for this unsolved mystery. "Oh God, I want to wander." He got his wish. Whether he found what he was looking for, or met an end he never expected, remains one of the Colorado Rockies' most enduring enigmas.